What would you say to Donald Trump?
Of course, Donald Trump is elected by American people. I must respect. But his sort of also the expression, the America first, that I a little bit sort of also the wondering what that meaning. Then he withdraw from Paris, what's the ecological
Climate Accord.
Paris Climate Accord. He withdraw. I think that is wrong.
Many spiritual practitioners avoid politics entirely, but if Dharma practitioners care about reducing suffering, shouldn't we be paying more attention to the world of politics?
Oh, what a beautiful morning. Oh, what a beautiful day. Everything's peaceful and empty. Everything will be okay.
Welcome to A Mom and a Monk, a podcast where we discuss life, culture, and current events, all through the lens of the Buddhist teachings.
And bring the Buddha's wisdom into the chaotic world of parenting. I am Piyali Chedin, and a mother to a 9-year-old living in the Himalayas.
And I'm Lobsang Donyo, a monk who is living right now in the United States, or staying here while my monastery is in South India. And today we're going to start a little bit of a discussion around something that's been buzzing in the news lately with all these different things happening in the world of politics. So we've had recently the current party in power in the United States of America, the Republican Party, making efforts to have new legislation around voting called the SAVE Act. And we've had recent very major changes to an older voting law called the Voter Rights Act that was made by the Supreme Court, cases that were brought to the Supreme Court, and the decisions made sort of change the nature of that law, or at least how it has been interpreted until now. And then, of course, well, we have all these now, and the result of that was a lot of what's called redistricting or gerrymandering, and changing basically how votes are counted and how they get put towards different how people can vote for their representatives in Congress and the lower house, the House of Representatives. But really, this is all to say that, well, look at us here. Probably everybody listening to this podcast, I would imagine, unless you're in China or Russia, we live in democracies, right? And we have not only a privilege and a right, but we also have a responsibility. So how does this responsibility relate to our practice as Buddhists and our way of understanding the Buddhist goal of reducing and eliminating human suffering? So why don't you start us off, Piyali? What do you think? And with that first question, well, do you think we should be paying more attention to the world of politics, or is it okay as a spiritual practitioner, as a Buddhist, to just kind of say, you know what, I'm really happy to just do my Dharma practice, to study Buddhism, to transform my own mind. And hey, guess what? You think that's something small, but really, well, that's what the Buddha did, isn't it? And look at how much impact he was able to have. So what's wrong with that?
That's a question I often ask myself, but having been an activist in my life pre Dharma, I feel like I have a natural inclination to fight for justice. But however, since I've been on the path, I've often wondered whether a bodhisattva would vote in today's elections. And I really believe that they would, since a bodhisattva would carefully consider which candidate would bring the greatest benefit to a larger number of people and contribute in a more meaningful way and bring well-being to society and really extend that out to the world with wisdom and compassion as our guide. So I really feel like they would look at this as a responsibility that they would hold. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that it would really depend on the bodhisattva. There's a diversity of bodhisattvas, just like of ordinary citizens, and we know that out of ordinary citizens in the United States, at least, only about 2/3 of the eligible voters actually vote. Now, a big question I have, and there's some research on this and polling, etc., but this always grows. Your understanding of something always grows deeper if you really talk to people directly instead of just see a poll. But the question I have, like, why aren't you voting? What's going through your mind? What are you expecting will happen if you don't vote? What do you think would happen if you do vote? And then I also see there are situations that I can certainly empathize with, like the war or the violence in Gaza and the Israel's actions in Gaza that have left so many innocent people dead and killed them. And then during the 2024 presidential election, which are the most consequential, seemingly the most consequential elections in the United States, there was a big uncommitted movement, right? And this sort of abandon Harris kind of mentality, and people who are very brilliant and very, generally compassion based, at least in their values, stated values, I should say, didn't cast a vote for either of the two main candidates, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, because they wanted to support a candidate instead who would commit to trying to reduce the U.S. involvement with Israel and funding their war and their weapons and military and so on. So one could say, well, maybe a bodhisattva would choose that path because they don't want to commit to, they don't want to, put a vote towards someone who is going to continue funding that kind of violence. And I guess it just really just opens up opens up the reality of how complicated our world is, how complex the world of politics is, how we can only have one president at a time and they have to make so many decisions. We can only have one Congress and one Senate at a time, and they make so many decisions, and some of them are going to be for the better, some for the worse. And hey, guess what? We can't predict the future no matter what, so we don't really know. So I guess I would just say that, I wouldn't be shocked if there was a real dedicated Dharma practitioner or Bodhisattva or not, who does decide to say, you know what, I just don't really know what's going to happen, and I, don't have that much extra time to watch the news and to watch, pay attention to the pundits and the analysis, and I really just want to practice meditation and Dharma and study and transform my own mind. So I would say that it's okay to do that. It's okay to also pay attention and then combine your Dharma practice, your feelings of compassion, of universal responsibility that we develop through Dharma practice, and combine that with your political activism or just the simple action of voting. Is that sufficient, or you think that that kind of person would be shirking their duties as a citizen and as a Buddhist?
That's a really good question. I feel like we all wear many hats. I can say, for instance, His Holiness, he is the king of Tibet. He is the leader. He used to be the political leader of Tibet and obviously stepped down a few years ago, as we know. But I do feel like some people, some bodhisattvas, probably view social responsibility in different ways. However, I feel as Dharma friends, some of them they tend to wave off the conversation about voting or politics by saying it's just not my thing. I ignore it. I just want to live my life. It really does remind me of a similar response I would get from my new age spiritual friends or, my friends from Burning Man who would either not vote at all or vote for a third party candidate, as you mentioned, with no who really has no realistic chance of winning because they feel like it aligns more purely with their ideals. And I totally get that because, in ideal circumstances, perhaps I would vote for them too. But I think this is what the problem is. Disengaging doesn't remove harmful people from power. And I think that, taking the Mahayana precepts, I really do feel like I will strive to attain enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, leaving none aside. So perhaps I just take this in a different intensity. But and also in recent years, I've seen how deeply toxic leaders and policies are allowed to take hold. I mean, I don't know if it's just happening right now or since 2020 or if this was always the case, but I feel like the consequences are real. They affect lives, communities, ecosystems, and entire generations so swiftly. What do you think? Do you think that this is a recent development? Looking back at like the Bush era, Bush Senior, Bush Junior, even Clinton, I feel like things were kind of mildly moving with like tiny little shifts. I mean, perhaps maybe I was younger and I didn't notice, but I feel like right now with the current administration and even with leaders all across the world, like whether it's India or China or Russia, there's these decisions made by leaders that even like majority of their people, constituents don't agree with. It just sort of happens.
Mhm.
And this idea of democracy, I mean, I'm not talking about Russia and China in this case, but the idea of democracy is just like perhaps decreasing or
Yeah.
being
You know,
diminished.
I do think that it's pretty well documented, and there's lots of analysis of the history and different political, the current political movement, which we can call at this very moment these few countries you mentioned, United States and India's, uh, a kind of authoritarian movements, that those have been kind of building up for many decades, or at least there's been background work being done. As you knew, it was a big deal during the last election, this thing called Project 2025 in the United States. And that was a document that was put together by people who had been sort of working on developing those ideas and those ideals for a long time. And even going back to politicians and pundits and political commentators, from the prior generations and the Reagan era and even before that. And yeah, so it's sort of their efforts are paying off for, I'm sure as they feel that way, and that they're happy with how things are going because there are a lot of changes occurring quickly. And then part of that, of course, is the changes in technology, which kind of really always, in a sense, goes hand in hand with politics, even though it's its own segment of society, and it's they're mostly privately owned and run businesses that we're talking about, but they're very closely connected to politicians, of course. And so that's sort of enabling faster change to happen even in the world of politics, and it's also just its own thing that's changing our world. And so it all kind of blurs together in my mind, where the change is coming from. It's hard to see, but yes. But I know that obviously there are moments in history where change occurs at a faster rate, or more obvious changes are happening more quickly than others. And I would say that I'm sure back in the end of the 250 years ago, at the end of the 18th century, when Americans made the United States Declaration of Independence and drafted the U.S. Constitution, and gained and created this movement of democracy, which is still, its reverberations are still being felt throughout the world. I'm sure that felt like a big, there was a lot of big change, and there was a lot of movement happening, action happening. It was very, exciting, a very dynamic time, and of course wars. There was a war involved, and I'll just say that I do feel like a difference. So, but I'm sorry. I'm going on about that, but your comments were more before you asked that question. You were, talking about how some people just kind of ignore politics, and you feel like it's really, how did you phrase it? I mean, some basically that we have some responsibility, or you take it very seriously, or feel it more seriously. Your commitment to the Bodhisattva vow, right? Bodhisattva
Hmm.
precepts. Well, I would just say it's for me. So I'm going to be playing devil's advocate here, because I do actually agree with everything you've said, but at the same time, I have other feelings that seem to some degree contradict it. But I feel like it's really more just a matter of each person finding their own balance. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you really take this principle that, well, we live in a democracy, we have this unique capacity to impact our world. Unique meaning in the perspective of human civilizations since the beginning of modern, you know, since the beginning of human civilization. We have a unique ability to impact what's happening in our communities and societies through our vote. That's wonderful. That is a type of freedom, a type of liberty, a privilege, a type of power, capacity that we have in our hands. And we can, of course, infuse that capacity with compassionate motivation and do something good with it. But I would say if you really extend that thinking, then what would be the implications? So then you might have to say, well, if I really want to manifest my compassion in action, right, engaged Buddhism to its fullest, then not only should I vote, but I should run for office. Or I should, as you said before in your previous life, you were an activist, right? So I need to join some organization. If you really extend it out, then where does it end? Then you yourself should become this kind of, you might even want to say, well, the best way to have an impact on the world would to become something like the Dalai Lama and be a ruler who is just a monarch, and yourself an authoritarian who could just make all the decisions that are going to benefit, the benevolent Dharma king. And you should become a Chakravartin and rule the world and just benefit everybody, because you're going to be a bodhisattva who can do that, right? So it's kind of difficult to draw the line. So I want to ask you, do you think that's a reasonable way of thinking? And do you think there is a clear place to draw the line?
Oh boy. It's I don't have a good answer for any of this, but it all makes sense. But I do think, by logic, should we ignore war? Should we ignore suffering, ignore displaced families, people dying, or communities being completely stripped of their rights? Maybe some people try to look away, but eventually reality just catches up with all of us. I just recently I was messaging with a friend who's traveling in Europe, and we met her in Thailand over the winter. And when I asked her out of concern, like, oh no, you're traveling in Europe, are you okay from the war? And she just said, oh, that's not my reality. I'm just turning my, ignoring everything that's happening. Anyone who talks about it, I get to shape my own reality. And a part of me just thought, like, wow, that's a complete luxury right now, for some
Sure.
people.
Right,
And then
right.
I really thought, like, is that a good way to be? I mean, at some point, it will catch up to her one way or the other, whether it's renting a car in the next destination she's going to and realizing that the gas prices have skyrocketed, or perhaps it's running into newly escaped asylees. I mean, I have no idea. But I think generally speaking, I really try to reflect, like, what if I had so much money that I could just travel and just ignore all of these things? Or what if I was a hermit living in a crevice in the Himalayas and doing my practice? Would I still be able to escape things that are happening? Yeah, it's a question I've often pondered. But I think w- one of the hats I wear other than a Dharma practitioner is one of a parent. And so that perspective has really helped me investigate in strengthening my community and looking at different ways to ensure the stability, safety, and as well as the health of the environment around me, especially for my daughter. Because of this, it's become very important to pay attention to how funds are allocated within our communities and how different levels of the government support programs that directly affect our daily lives. So, this basically includes education, healthcare, access to public services, our library, our community centers, and also the maintenance of public spaces that we use every single day. So, education especially feels very personal to me. And like many parents, I want my daughter to have access to excellent teachers, strong academic instruction, and of course, supporting learning environments that allow her to thrive. And what I noticed when I was in the US in 2023, and prior to that, for 6 years, was that we were witnessing how federal legislation could really shape not only the US, but it also influenced the rest of the world. And that's when I really realized that voting deeply matters. And it's very important to stay informed about our leaders and also just make decisions to really help shape a future that would be securing our future for our children. And it really, the different things that fall under that umbrella is like things such as global warming, or whether women have autonomy over their reproductive rights, and whether people are able to freely express themselves. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different topics, but
Of
yeah.
course. And again, each one of them is very complex. I mean, if you obviously we don't have to go into this as a major discussion now, but it it does have these differing, values that we might hold in ourselves, in our root core root values that sort of tug in different directions when it comes to policy decisions, when it comes to policy decisions like these the huge topic of abortion. Of course, as a monk, I'm not a if I advise someone to get an abortion and they do, I lose my vow immediately, right? That's considered an act of killing, or being the person who sort of instigated the killing. Now, it's not the killing of a human being that's acknowledged, because it's acknowledged in the Buddhist traditional text that a fetus is not a human being, but it's a developing human, right? A developing human fetus. So it's considered, as far as karma is concerned, it's a little different than killing a born human, but in terms of the monastic vow, it's still considered enough to, strong enough action to lose your vow. One of the four root vows is not to take a human life, right? So anyway, so my point is that there's I guess what I'm really trying to just get at is how I really am when it comes to policy decisions. I realize that there are so many components to think about. I feel like I could empathize with someone who just feels like it's too overwhelming and there's too much doubt about what really is the best decision or the best move, and if they feel that it's more comfortable, or even just they feel like it's more real, it's really speaking their truth more fully to just refrain, because otherwise they're going to be voting for something that they're not really confident will bring about benefit for people, right? Because there's so many different conflicting values that, it's hard to pick which one to kind of put your political power or political will into. But I just want to go back for 1 second to what you were saying about your friend in Europe. Absolutely, you can be insulated. This is what's happening with the stock market right now in the US, right? It's like the stock market hit record highs yesterday, right? First time in history, we have a $5.5 trillion company. NVIDIA is the highest valued company ever in the history of the world. And that's going on while about a fifth of the world's oil is being cut off from being sent out around the world because the Strait of Hormuz is still closed in Iran. And somehow, while you have people in countries like India, where you are, like the Philippines, like Thailand, people have to ration their fuel, right? They have to travel less. Prices are going so high that the poorest, billion people in the world who are still considered to be poverty because they live on $3 a day or less, those people are suffering immensely, and I'm sure it's having genuine, life or death consequences. I mean, death consequences most likely, although I haven't seen any direct reporting on that. If you lose your ability to buy food, to buy fuel, to, the basic necessities of life because things are too expensive, and those governments don't have the best, social, security, social nets. Sorry, they don't have the best social nets in the world. People are going to die. People are going to get sick. People are going to not be able to get the medical care they need, not going to be able to get the food they need. So, of course, I think when we talk about this, like your friend who's just sort of saying, it's not my reality, I choose my reality. Well, as this is the thing, where Buddhists, we're trying to develop a new, we're creating our reality too. That is true, you create your own reality. And our reality that we're creating is one where, as Shangji Deva says in his wonderful text, The Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, suffering is suffering. I'm not quoting exactly, I'm sorry, but something like suffering is suffering. It doesn't matter if it's my suffering, your suffering, or their suffering. Suffering is suffering, and thus I shall remove it. Right? So this is the whole idea, is that we're making, as a Buddhist, we recognize that the way to achieve the greatest, most fulfilling life for ourselves, right, is to include everyone else in our circle of dear ones, in our inner circle. And by doing that, then we just can't ignore it anymore, right? Our practice includes the necessity to bring other suffering into our own our own lives, such that we want to remove their suffering as much as our own. But I still have a big question. But what's the most effective way to do that? Is it to vote? Is it to become a politician? Is it to just sit in the cave in the Himalayas and really transform your mind, develop shamatha, develop bodhicitta, develop the wisdom of emptiness?
Mm-hmm. I think you brought up some really good points. I mean, I feel like one thing that I heard you say was that different people have different capacities, and some people just have to, for their own sanity or whatever their bandwidth is, they just need to remove themselves. And that kind of reminds me of when I first learned about Mahayana practitioners, or people in Tibetan Buddhism, who obviously have taken a vow to attain enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, how some of them are actually in lifelong retreats. And I often wondered, like, wow, why do they get to do that? Because that's what I want to do. um, and then why are some, not doing that? Like, why isn't His Holiness
Mm.
the Dalai Lama doing that? And I think that there are many different roles, and for some people, I mean, it could be karma, where their role, their inclinations, their life takes them in a different direction. Like, do I really feel like Milarepa would go out and vote? I don't think so. I feel like he benefits in completely different ways. So, so I feel like, yeah, I think that,
He benefits others. He brings
yes,
about the
benefits
benefit
others.
of
Yeah,
the
that's what I
world in
meant to
different ways.
say.
Right, right.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, just
through different
clarifying.
means. Yeah, so I think that there are, there people just have different capacities, and I
Yeah,
think it really depends on how involved you are in worldly dharma, how much of it you need to still be a part of. Are you still working? Do you have a child in school? Do
exactly.
you?
What is your current life situation? What are your responsibilities? And to be honest, when we talk about worldly dharmas or being worldly, and from what I understand of the Buddhist teachings, it really is just in terms of whether or not you have attachment to reputation, right? Praise, gain, or wealth, pleasure, and whether you have aversion to their opposites. And if you're going about living in the world, reading the news, making your voice heard through your vote and contacting your elected representatives or other more direct impact forms of activism, or caring for your child, or doing your job, whatever it is. If you're doing it with a motivation of bodhicitta, that's dharma. That's not worldly activity. That is pure
Mm.
dharma, and especially if you're able to combine an understanding of emptiness, where you really go about all these actions seeing that there's no independent I who's doing these actions. There's no I that is somehow outside of the ever-changing flux of body mind, of your own body mind, as well as the other external things external to your body and mind, which are influencing you, right? In other words, the agent, the me who's doing these actions, who's working, who's caring for my family, who's listening to the news, who's having conversations, that I is completely contingent on a wide variety of factors. If you can hold awareness of that, then you don't get trapped into a worldly mind. And if you're not in a worldly mind, which means basically a mind is, to use the Buddhist terminology, with afflictions, with self-grasping ignorance. If you can avoid getting sucked into that kind of mind state, those kinds of emotions, those tugs of our, evolutionary heritage that pull us into suffering, then you're practicing Dharma the whole time that you're doing those other activities.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think that when I moved back to the States in 2017 with my daughter, I felt as though I wanted to refrain from anything political because of the person who was in power at the time. And what I realized was that there were so many different things that directly affected our lives, or there were things that I felt would be really great if they were continued to be in place. Like, for instance, segregating our garbage, or having um, the library get more books in for children and have more free activities for my toddler. So I felt like these little things were just so wonderful, and I was so happy that these programs even existed, and I really wanted to keep them in place, and also making sure that our neighborhood was safe and had playgrounds and things like that. So I really started realizing that our city or town government really made such a big difference in who was in power. So in tiny little ways, I felt like I was getting more and more invested into,
Right. If you're
the
if you're just
community.
paying attention to your own life and what's happening. I mean, I was only able to go and train at Shravasti Abbey, where I did my initial sort of monastic training and get introduced to monastic life. I was there about 2 years in the early 2010s. And it was only because of a policy that the Barack Obama administration, President Obama administration, had put into place, which was called the Income-Based Repayment Plan, the IBR, so that I could defer repayment of my student loans, go and live in this place where I wasn't earning any income, and then later go back to work so I could repay those loans, which I was able to do. And it was only because of a government policy, right? And if that president hadn't been there, it very, very likely would never have been passed, as because we know what the contenders wanted to do instead. But I will say that what you're saying is funny, because the one big doubt that could arise for a Buddhist or someone interested in spiritual practice in general is like, well, hey, Buddhist texts don't talk about political activism. They don't talk even about political participation, you know, and neither do the other religions, right? Well, in some ways they actually do. It's just that the structures, because there weren't these active, participatory democracies in the world at that time, right? I mean, that kind of difference was expressed though in some of the Buddhist texts. So we have, of course, the Buddha himself giving advice to various political leaders, kings, and then we have, for instance, Nagarjuna, he's considered the founder of the Madhyamaka school of Buddhist philosophy and one of the major Mahayana Buddhist proponents of Mahayana Buddhism from the 2nd century AD, 2nd century CE. And what does he have? He has letters to kings, right? The letter to a friend, as well as the precious garland letter. Those are 2 letters of advice to kings. And in those letters, he tells the king, he implores the king. In those letters, he tells the king, you should create this kind of structure for the people and give them this and give them that. And and if you want the details, go read those texts. But he gives a lot of specific policy guidance to the kings. But we could also take that as guidance to us. In other words, we're not kings, but we have a voice in our political process. So we can, like you're saying, Piyali, vote for the people and tell our representatives that we want these kinds of policies in place, right? Making sure, I mean, he talks about how to treat prisoners, don't just torture them, and don't just imprison them, just because you're spiteful towards them, but really so that they can, really talking about it more as a institution of corrections, so that they can right their wrong behaviors, and there are so many things like this. So again, I think that that's just a sign that, yes, the great Buddhist masters of the past, they really did intend for a Dharma practitioner to be involved in the political process. And then my final comment I'll make for this is just to say, and then look at the Tibetan community and even other Buddhist communities. The last king of Thailand, who was the Rama the Ninth was his name, and he ruled until he passed away in 2016. The Thai people consider him a bodhisattva because he did so much for the Thai people, for the country. Likewise, people consider the Bhutanese king, the Bhutanese people, to be a bodhisattva. Now, I'm sure both of them have their controversial actions, but likewise, the Tibetans had His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who was from the 5th Dalai Lama until the 14th Dalai Lama, until he, you know, of his own accord, of his own will, gave up the role of secular leader in 2001, and then fully retired from political involvement in 2011. And in that situation also, the first president of the Tibetan exile government, the CTA, Central Tibetan Administration, was, if you remember, a monk. Right? His Eminence Samdong Rinpoche for 10 years was the Sikyong, or president of the Central Tibetan Administration. So there's definitely, both in the texts themselves and in the lived reality of Buddhist practitioners and Buddhist cultures and societies, a very, very evident place for our ideals and practice of compassion and bodhicitta to be manifest in political action.
That makes complete sense. Yeah.
It seemed like when we started this discussion, you were convinced that it's a responsibility of a Dharma practitioner, of a Buddhist, to be involved in the political process, to use their vote, to use their voice. Do you still feel like it's their responsibility, or do you think there's a little bit of leeway for people to just make their own decision in that regard?
So yeah, I think that I still feel like people are responsible for the world around them. Even as a Dharma practitioner, I feel as though people have different capacities. So I definitely have a better understanding of that. Thank you for explaining and shaping that perspective. However, I do feel like suffering is a reality, and especially as a Dharma practitioner, we do contemplate that very often. And I think it is important in our own ways, however that may be, to really extend ourselves. And if it means being a recluse and doing your practice, that is great too. Perhaps there's a bigger picture that we're not aware of. And I do feel like bodhisattvas, in particular, act in ways that we don't always understand, and they have a larger picture that we just can't really see, but it makes sense later. So I also feel like there's a lot of space for that
That's
in my mind.
absolutely true. Yeah. So I would agree with your conclusion. We have a responsibility for the world around us because we are active participants in creating that world. But the means we use to impact it and to impact it for the better can vary widely. Maybe if, again, it might make the most sense. And I'm kind of curious why there isn't more, like, for a Buddhist to become a billionaire CEO, and then they can fund Buddhist publications and create monasteries and temples and places for people to study and universities to learn Dharma, places for people to do retreat. If we had one billionaire philanthropist who wanted to help American Buddhism thrive, or Buddhism throughout the world, they would have a huge impact, right? That might be a great thing to do. And then, of course, there's the people who, like you said, are doing retreat. And again, when you think about it, I was asked this question when I was in Singapore recently by some Dharma friends. They said, what do you think is the karma, the collective karma that we've created that led to the US President Donald Trump being president? And, it's a good question because we did create the karma to have this political situation in our world. And then I thought about it. It was the first time I thought about that question. I said, I bet it's dishonesty. Have you ever lied before? I asked them and everyone goes, yeah. Right? We've all lied before. And I can really, see, like, yes, not only do we create our political reality through our vote, but through our karma as well. So we also have a responsibility to watch our actions.
Yeah, that's a great point, and that's a wonderful question.
It was. Yeah.
Yeah, there is that collective karma, and that is something that we can't deny or fight. So that's a great point.
So maybe we can end on a prayer for all of the people who have power to affect our world through their vote, that they also can be guided by compassion and by clarity of mind to also create a good world through their day-to-day actions, right? Every interaction that we have throughout the day, we do so with honesty, transparency, consideration of the feelings and needs of others, and kindness. And I think then I think our world will be pretty good, in that the politicians who get into the place of being candidates, right, who we have the opportunity to vote for, will be better quality stock of politician.
Yeah, that is our hope.
Yes. Have a good evening. See you next week.